Good afternoon, gentlemen. This video will serve as an introduction to our new topic, logic. Logic is the science of analyzing arguments. We use arguments to prove our points. An argument is comprised of premises leading up to a conclusion. Now, there's two types of logic arguments, deductive and inductive. In deductive logic, the conclusion follows of necessity from the premises. That means that I'm trying to convince you that it's impossible for you to reach any other conclusion, that you really have to accept what I believe. On the other hand, in inductive logic, the conclusion only probably follows from the premises. I'm not insisting that you agree with me, but I'm telling you I'm probably right. Let's address inductive logic first. Recall that inductive logic is when I'm showing you the likelihood of my claim. A good clue word for inductive logic is the word probably. Here's an example. A lot of guys that go to SJJ are really smart. Billy Bob goes to SJJ. Therefore, Billy Bob is probably smart. That should make sense. But we also know that those kinds of arguments don't work all the time. Consider this example that follows the same pattern. Most Minecraft players are teenage boys. Patrick 1942 is a person who plays Minecraft. Therefore, Patrick 1942 is probably a teenage boy. It's the same kind of argument, and it makes sense. But we know the conclusion isn't true because I'm not a teenage boy. Now, when we look at inductive arguments, we need to make some distinctions between different kinds. We divide them into strong arguments and weak arguments. Then we examine this being cogent or uncogent. If I'm making a strong case for my argument, that it's more than 50% true, then it's a strong argument. If there's not really a strong connection between my premises and my conclusion, then it's a weak argument. Let's use an example. For instance, if I say every pope in the history of Christianity has been a male, therefore the next one will be a male too, then I'm making a pretty strong argument. It's a reasonable claim. On the other hand, if I say a few bishops have been members of religious orders, so the next bishop of Toledo will be a member of religious order, then I'm making a pretty weak argument, simply because I'm only arguing it based on a few people. The word cogent comes from the Latin cogere and ends up meaning convincing in English. Only strong arguments can be cogent. You can never have a weak cogent argument. There's zero kinds of that argument. Nope. On the other hand, both strong and weak arguments can end up being uncogent. For instance, looking back at our original strong argument about the popes, we can make an argument just as strong that ends up being uncogent. All popes in the history of Christianity have been women, so the next pope will be a woman too. The argument has the same amount of strength, but the premise it's relying on, that all popes ever have been women, is simply untrue. For a strong argument to be uncogent like that, it needs to have a false premise. It might have a false conclusion too, or it might not. All weak arguments, as we said, are uncogent. That's enough for now in inductive logic. We use inductive logic without thinking about it all the time. We might think to ourselves, usually my math homework doesn't take too long, so I'll have time to do it during study hall tomorrow. That's a strong argument and a cogent argument. Of course, it doesn't always work out, but it was a logical idea. Deductive logic, on the other hand, argues about definitelys. There's no probablys here. In deductive logic, you think for sure that you're right based on the information provided. Deductive logic uses careful forms to make its point. For instance, there's a basic deductive logical form called modus ponens. There's the spelling. Modus ponens says, if A, then B, A, therefore B. Here's an example. If you attend St. John's, then you're a male. You attend St. John's. Therefore, you're a male. The logic of this should be apparent. Now, just as we did with inductive logic, we should make some distinctions. We've already said that deductive arguments are a definitely kind of logic. Here we have arguments divided into valid and invalid, and then sound and unsound. In a valid logical form, the premises correctly work from premise to conclusion. In the invalid logical form, you might be saying true things, but the premises don't necessarily move to the conclusion. For instance, it might sound logical at first to use this argument. If you attend SJJ, then you're a male. Dak is a male. Therefore, Dak must attend SJJ. Since we all know Dak and he attends SJJ, this argument seems to be correct, but the form of it is actually invalid. Let's substitute the name out and try this again. If you attend SJJ, then you're a male. J. Bell is male. Therefore, J. Bell attends SJJ. However, J. Bell doesn't attend SJJ. He's actually the football coach of one of our rivals. So even though the details sometimes might look right, the form isn't. You'll notice that this is sort of a backwards modus ponens, so don't get them confused. Modus ponens, on the other hand, is a valid form. Now, we also need to look at the soundness of an argument. Valid versus invalid just looks at the shape of the argument. Sound versus unsound looks at the truth. You can have a valid sound argument, but you can never have an invalid sound argument. On the other hand, you can have both valid and invalid unsound arguments. Now, this might be a little confusing, such as how you could have a valid unsound argument, but we'll look at more examples in class. Now, there is one more thing we haven't discussed yet that's essential to logic, and that's fallacies. Logical fallacies can be either inductive or deductive. They're when someone seems like they're being logical, but either on purpose or by accident, they're actually making a big mistake in their logic. You want to pay attention to these because, one, you might realize that what someone is trying to convince you of isn't actually logical at all, and two, if you make one of these logical fallacies, people won't be convinced by your argument. So, if you want to be able to defend your ideas and not be fooled by other people's, it's important to have a handle on inductive and deductive logic, as well as being able to recognize logical fallacies. Let's do a quick review. Logic is the science of evaluating arguments. Arguments are built by premises supporting a conclusion. Arguments can be either inductive or deductive. Inductive arguments try to convince you that something is probably true. Deductive arguments try to convince you that something is definitely true. Inductive arguments are either strong or weak, cogent or uncogent. If you want to convince someone of something inductively, you want a strong, cogent argument. Deductive arguments are either valid or invalid, sound or unsound. If you want to convince someone deductively, you want a valid, sound argument. Fallacies can be either deductive or inductive and make your argument uncogent or unsound. That's it for an introduction to logic. Don't forget to do the assignment after you've finished watching the video. There's a box below for you to ask any questions that you'd like me to answer in class. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.